So here's the thing. I'll give you guys a few moments to kind of get settled here. So with Ethos, the idea of this is Ethos is the culture of an organization. It's the culture, the beliefs, the characteristics of an organization, of a system, for our case, a church. And Ethos is a time that we can worship a little bit longer, that we can be a little bit more free, that we're talking to insiders. That's what this is about. And it's a time for us to really dive in and talk about some things that really affect our lives, but maybe are some things that are a little bit below the surface, a little more complex than we would tackle on a Sunday morning. And for this first one, I really did wrestle for a long time. Like, there's a million directions where we could go with this. And I thought I would start off with the basics. So today, you can write at the top of your paper, we're gonna be talking about, it's gonna be really complex, so you might need to slow down as you spell this. God, right? Like super, super complex, I know. So right at the top of your paper, God. All right, that's what we're gonna be talking about today. I know this is gonna go real deep, real fast, but here's what I want you guys to do specifically. We're gonna start off, and I'm gonna need a little participation from you guys. So if you're a little sleepy, just nudge someone next to you and they'll nudge you right back. So here's what I need you to do. I need you guys to participate. I want everyone on your pad of paper, and this may not be something you've ever really thought about or ever thought to do, I want you to draw a picture of God. Right? I know. No, but for real, draw a picture of God. Some of you are like, oh, I'm not an artist. Hey, you can be Picasso, be abstract. It doesn't matter. I want you all to do this. This is participatory. So you're like in kindergarten again. You got to do this. So draw a picture of God. That's good. That's good. Now I'm kind of curious what, raise your hand. Is anybody done? Anybody finished? I'm kind of curious. Is anyone brave enough to like show me what you drew? Anybody? Okay, come here real quick. Let me see what you got. Anybody else? Somebody else. Give me like 2 other people to come down here and show me what you drew. So I'm going to tell people what you drew so you guys can find out the different answers. What do we got here? Oh, we got a heart. That's good. A heart. What do we have over here? We've got a cross. That's good. What do we got here? We've got the sun. All right. What else? A smiling face.
Guess what that is.
That's an explosion. What is that? You've got some weird theology. I don't know. What is it? What is it? It was like a bomb going off. It's what?
My interpretation.
That's sure. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So did everybody try to draw a picture of God? I know you could get smart and you could just like leave it blank. Like God is everything. Anybody do that? It's either like really profound or cheating. I don't know which it is. Okay. So under that, we'll draw, one of them that just hit me that somebody else drew, they drew a sun. So we'll draw a sun up here. That works. Okay, now I want you to write about God. So who is God? What's God like? Some characteristics. What is God? Describe him. So you're writing, who is God? What is God? Take it any direction you want. All right, I want some feedback. Somebody say some things you wrote. Judge, shout some things out. Love. We got some copycats. We got a few loves. What else? Creator. Friend. Comforter. The explosion girl was like, pum, pum, pum. It was comforter. It took me a while to get it. It's okay, Kayla. Love. Was that it? Love? What's that? Merciful. Father. Okay, great. Yeah, great. Here's some other. If you go most of you guys went like metaphors with God. Judge, Father, love, a lot of those. In the Bible, we could do like a sword drill here. Anybody remember sword drills? Grow up in church, you can say a verse and you have to look it up the fastest. Some of you guys got sword drills on lockdown. But here's what we're gonna do. Think of throughout the Bible some different, and I'll write some different metaphors used for God. I'm gonna write down a few. You can shout them out. I'm just gonna write some down. We got rock. That's one. Somebody said father. We'll write that down. We got shepherd. And let's go, there, fountain, that's one that's in there. Lion, there you go. Lion, sword is one that's in there. We'll go to some more obscure ones. Cup, that's one that's in there. How about this? Shade, tower, mean, we could go on and on. Let's see, fire, got builder. We could go on and on with some of these metaphors. There's also architect, avenger, help, healer, deliverer, stronghold, horn, venter, vine, all these different things to describe God. God also has all these different names. And here's the thing, when we look at these things and we say that God is a rock, is God a rock? Anybody? No, but what is this? I mean, is God a cup? Is he a venter? Is he a vine? No, but it helps us understand who God is, right? There are attributes from that. In what ways is God like a fountain? In what ways is God like a lion? These are words used to describe God. And all of these, right now we're all going, yeah, like this makes sense, right? But there are some descriptions of God in the Bible that don't sit as easy as God is our shade, right? There are some that like don't sit quite as well with us because we're not as accustomed to them. We're not quite as used to them. There may be some of these as I went through and like, God is architect, and you're like, I mean, sure, but is that in there? Like where? And it is. And there's all these different ways that we're used to experiencing God. And when God shows up in these ways, we're like, yeah, that makes sense. But for us in the West, there's also some ways that God's talked about that we're not really used to. In fact, one thing that I've noticed, and this is what I've noticed, is that we tend to find masculine names for God, right? God is our father, right? God is our judge, and with this sort of thing. But God also has feminine characteristics and feminine names throughout the Bible. Did you know that? Like at the beginning of creation, Hebrew, words have both male and female associations, feminine nouns and male nouns. In the very beginning of creation, God was there, and it says that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Anybody, Genesis 1, anybody tracking with me there? That word spirit in Hebrew is a feminine noun. So God is referred to in the feminine form as much as he is in the male form. Actually, it's more in the male form, but he's also referred to in the feminine form. A few places I wrote down here. Let's see. Spirit in Hosea, God is spoken of as a mother protecting her children, a mother bear robbed of her cubs. How many would like that one? Like sometimes I need God to be a mother bear that just got robbed of her cubs for me. Let's see, in Deuteronomy, a mother eagle protecting her youngs, a woman giving birth. In Isaiah, God is a comforting mother, a nursing mother, a woman in labor. In the New Testament, God is referred to as a mother hen protecting her young and a woman searching for her lost coins, right? Would we say all those things are true of God as well? Right? We're all tracking there, right? Let's go even more weird. Let's keep going down this weird train. And I'm going to show you where we're going with this. How many of you have heard of, I'm probably going to spell it wrong. Yeah, it's pretty simple. Okay. How many of you guys have heard of this name of God? AI, I think I got that right. Yeah, AI. How many of you have heard of this name? Oh, there's an H. Got it. That's not our Shaddai. How many of you have heard of El Shaddai? How many of you heard the famous Amy Grant song, El Shaddai, right? Like, how many of your childhood was full of Amy Grant and singing El Shaddai? How many of you have no clue what we're talking about right now? Like, Amy Grant does not ring a bell. Absolutely. You're like, what is wrong with you people? Oh, man, you missed out on some stuff that you're just fine without it. Well, anyway, so El in Hebrew, it just means God. So many times when it's, El Shaddai or these different names for God, it means God, and then this is the descriptor for God. So in the same way, God is rock, he's like all of these things. Well, what's interesting about Shaddai is in most of our Bibles, it's translated that God is our provider, right? Anybody, El Shaddai, God's our provider, right? That's what it means. But what's interesting is when you look at the base word shad in the Hebrew, there's a lot of different questions in the Hebrew as to where El Shaddai kind of got its meaning. And what we can draw from what's interesting is in every place except for two that El Shaddai is used is talking about God providing in the sense of fertility, of God providing, for instance, and speaking to Abraham that his wife would give birth, for God is El Shaddai. And Jacob talking about his descendants, they would be fruitful and multiply. Ruth, where Naomi is lamenting, believing that God is El Shaddai, that she'll no longer be barren. These different places, in every place, it's referring to fertility, to someone being barren, to God providing descendants. And what's interesting is that word in Hebrew, shad, any guesses to what that might mean? It's going to offend some sensibilities here. Shad in Hebrew means breast. So So how we would look at this, and we understand that God is our provider, and like those different places that God is nursing and sustaining in the same way that God is the provider, we're looking at it in this lens. So I'm gonna read for you Genesis 49, verse 25. So if you wanna write that down, Genesis 49, verse 25. So in this place, and I'm gonna read it with a Hebrew commentary. So in this place, it only uses Shaddai, it doesn't use El Shaddai, it just talks about Shaddai. So let me read this in this Hebrew commentary. By the God of your father, who will help you, by Shaddai, who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts, Shaddaiim, and of the womb. So directly translated, El Shaddai means God of the breasts. Now, how does that sit with you as you're thinking about Amy Grant's song, El Shaddai, right? Like it just ruined the whole song for you, right? You can never listen to Amy Grant's song, El Shaddai, again. You're like, I just can't go there, right? Like it rests funny with us. And isn't it interesting that, and we know this, does this mean that God is the God of breasts? I mean, in the sense that God is a rock, in the sense that God is a provider, in the sense in all those ways. But is God feminine or is God male? Neither, right? Like God is no more, let's go to the next page here. God is no more male. There's an L, I keep leaving out letters. Then he is female. I'll catch all the letters on this one, I promise. It's neither, right? I mean, in the creation account, that's why the Hebrew authors used both male and feminine. And then it said what? In our image, we created them male and female. It's like together we get this picture of who God is, that if we only focus on one aspect, we're missing out on these qualities and these characteristics of who God is. Now you might be wondering like, Dan, where are you going? Like this is just weird. Like I understand that this feels a little weird, that this doesn't sit quite right, that we're, maybe feeling a little funny. What I want to talk about is in a moment, we're going to be talking about theology, and we'll talk about what theology is. But at face value, if we're not careful, it's easy to think, well, theology never really lands in my life. Like, how does it really affect me? What does theology really have to do with me waking up and going to work tomorrow? And what I'm gonna talk about is the way that we view God. Our theology very much impacts our choices, how we live our lives, and even our visceral reactions. Let me show you what I mean. So can we say, and I'm going, please hear me, don't read into this. I'm going to refer to God in male pronouns because that's our culture, that's our understanding. He's referred to as male more commonly than female because of the culture in that time, the culture of our day. So just follow me on that. But would we agree that God is no more male than he is female? Right? We all together on that? Like, we don't need to start arguing about how God is wired. God doesn't have a body, right? Like female, male, God is beyond all of that. Okay, so we would agree with that. So it's no less accurate for the Bible and the Hebrew to say the Spirit of God being female hovered over the waters. We got a problem with the Hebrew Bible saying that? No, we're good with that, right? Because we realize it's a metaphor to explain God, right? But how would you feel, Benji, you got your microphone? Can we turn Benji's microphone on?
Check. I do have my microphone.
How would we feel if next Sunday morning, Benji stood up on the stage and he led us in worship as we all sang,
"Oh, how she loves us so. Oh, how she loves us. How she loves us so."
Right? Right? Now, how many of you, at face value, are kind of ooh, right? Now, some of you are hey, I can go with that, and that's fine or whatever. But I would argue most of you are some of you bring it on, right? I get it. But most of you, was there not a part of you that was oh, right? That's weird, right? Benji's as I talked to him beforehand, he's I don't know if I can sing that. I don't know, man. How about you just sing it? And I'm no, I think it improved the point better, right? And if we went on and said, we are her portion, she is our prize, drawn to redemption by the grace in her eyes. In some ways, God's eyes being full of grace makes more sense in that lens sometimes, but there's something in us. Or if I stood up, can you imagine what would happen if it was Mother God, we pray to you, right? Everyone would be deuces, I'm out, right? Every single person is I am done. And I say that to say, now, am I saying is God any more female, male? None of the above, right? But don't you see how your theology, and even something you can cognitively agree to, I agree that God is neither one of these, that he is beyond this explanation, that this just helps us, gives us a way to understand God. This is all metaphor. God is beyond this. Even in light of that, some of you had a visceral reaction to that song, didn't you? Some of you immediately are like, oh, you see, theology affects even how we react physically. It affects every part of us. So people who are like, oh, theology doesn't matter, oh, whatever, it does affect us. It affects every single one of us. Now, again, throughout today, I'm going to continue to refer God, he. I'm just going to do that by default because I think I don't want you to leave. That's the real reason. So anyway, so how we think about God, even the metaphors we use when we talk about God, influence our behaviors and our reactions. So we have to first grasp that. So as we talk about theology, because that's what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be diving in. We talk about, I didn't leave out any letters. We're going to be talking about theology. And again, it's easy to think like, oh, my life isn't affected by this. Dan, this is way too complicated. I'm just a pretty simple person. What I'm arguing is your theology does affect you already. So what's important is to realize how it is affecting you and how it does affect your relationships, your relationship with God, your relationship with other people. Our theology is shaping our decisions, whether we realize it or not. So theology, the definition of theology is just the study of, anyone? God. Theology is just the study of God. It's a study of his nature, of his character. And so far this evening, what have we been talking about? At the beginning, I said we were going to talk about what? God, right? But from the beginning, all of this, and all of this, are we really talking about God? Think about it. Or are we talking about theology? Because as soon as you even say God, and I'm going to describe God, you're going to do what? You're going to use metaphor, right? You're going to use analogy. God is like. So all of a sudden, we can't describe God. We are so limited in our understanding and our vocabulary. We are limited to words, and words have meaning, and God is beyond all of that, isn't he? So we really, anytime we attempt to talk about God, really what we're talking about is we're talking about our theology about God, because God stands beyond all of those things. We've been talking about images. We drew a picture of God. We wrote down what God is like, and these images and these metaphors can even give us a visceral reaction. When we sing songs are theology. I know because I've talked to Benji about this. He thinks about the songs he chooses because he realizes we're not just singing songs, we're creating theology in our church by the songs we sing. We are making faith claims and fact claims about who we declare God to be by the songs we choose to sing. So everything, when we talk about God, immediately we're talking about theology. God stands outside of our language. He stands outside and beyond all of our understanding. So to attempt to talk about God, we're right away talking about theology, not really talking about God. Are we tracking so far? Okay, let me give you an analogy. Let me give you a theological argument. Hope I don't run out of paper. In certain circles, there's this big argument about their people's theology, and it usually breaks down into a few different camps. But basically, which one we're going to do? Oh, yes. So we're going to talk about free will versus, anyone? I heard some groaning, destination. Now, I'm not really going to dive into this and give you some, attempt at an answer or my thoughts on this. I'm just going to use this for sake of an argument. Has anyone, and probably the person groaning, got into a discussion, I'm going to call it discussion because that's polite, with someone else about free will versus predestination, and you instantly got tired, right? Like it's just exhausting. Because here's the thing, when people go down, it is like a throwdown on this. Many times in the predestination camp, you'll hear people declare that they're Calvinists. There's 5-point Calvinists and 4-point Calvinists, and they care about tulips and all of those sorts of things. So that's predestination. That was a Calvinist joke. None of you got it. And then there's Armenians. Tulip is, never mind. Anyway, so Armenians, they would agree with free will, that we've got a choice. Now, let me explain for those of you that are extremely exhausted already and are like, I don't care. Let me set this up a little bit. What predestination says, and people who believe in predestination get their beliefs from the Bible. Anyone know where people who believe in free will get their beliefs from? You're tracking, right? So people who believe in predestination would say that people are predestined for either heaven or hell. That people are preordained, pre-chosen. And this doesn't sit right, but then they bring up verses and you're like, ooh, yeah, that's hard to get through, right? And people who are really on this track would go to what they call double election. That means some people are either elected for heaven, and in the same way, some people are elected and predestined for hell. Now, they get this from the Bible, and they will, man, you could get into an argument. I've got a friend that has a church where there's a lot of people that really wrestle with this, and they love to talk about this, and he doesn't, right? And then other people would say, no, everyone has free will, and you get to choose God or not choose God. And you're like, you might sit there and you might go, well, that sounds like it makes sense. And in some ways it does, but the Calvinists would argue, actually, you're kind of lowering God, that God has the power to do what God wills. And they use verses for this, and people get into this argument. Now, here's the problem with this. We are trying to, with our limited understanding, to understand a God beyond all reason, right? So we're probably gonna fall a little short. There's this great book, has anybody read, it's a pretty old book called Flatland. Anyone ever heard of the book Flatland? We got one, yes, it's a great book. It was written, I believe, in the 70s, and it's kind of a philosophical book, and it's a fiction account about a world that only exists in 2 dimensions. So this is gonna be tricky, but I want you just to kind of try to wrap your brain around this. Imagine that we lived in a world that only had an X and a Y axis. So you live in a 2-dimensional world. So there is no, however you draw 3D, like this 3rd dimension. So everything is flat. So look at your piece of paper. Everything exists on a 1 point in depth plane. So as you look out, all you see are either lines or dots. There is no dimension to it, right? And this in Flatland, this author talks about a world where these points, and it's this whole thing, and it's this caste system, and lower caste men are like triangles, and the more sides you have, the higher up you are in the caste system, and it looks different. He goes to great lengths to explain it. Women are lines. So if it actually talks about if they can't go in a straight line because they can just pierce right through someone because they appear as a single point. It's really weird. So they have to go in this like swervy line or whatever. Anyway, it talks about what would happen if a 3-dimensional person or a 3-dimensional object came in contact with a 2-dimensional world. So imagine we exist on this, and we've got some triangles, right? And we've got some squares, and we've got some ladies, right? And imagine this is a world that we live in, and then it comes in contact with something from a 3rd dimension. And how would those 2-dimensional objects and beings describe that 3rd dimension? If I were to put my hand through this 2nd dimension, it would first show up as like 5 dots, and then it would become 5 circles, and then it'd go back kind of into like one really big circle. Are you guys kind of wrapping your head around it? You guys tracking with this? Okay, how would those things be able to understand something that exists beyond their 2 dimensions? Right, it'd be like this weird, like imagine if I put my hand close, like really close, and these 2-dimensional objects were like, do you feel that? It just feels like something like Dan is near. Like it would seem like they can't quite see it, they can't quite experience it, but something just feels different. And they would see this and they'd try to use these language to understand, to explain what a 3-dimensional object would be like. And there's this one object that shows up that's a 3-dimensional object. I think it's a cube. And it starts to talk about this 3-dimensional world. And all these 2-dimensional beings are like, you're insane, you're crazy. In the same way, I think so many times when we talk about God, we're talking about something that exists beyond all of our dimensions, beyond the 3 dimensions of space and the 4th dimension of time. God is beyond time, right? So here, let me use this as an example. I want you, to the best of your ability, you live in a 2-dimensional world. Draw this marker in 2 dimensions on your piece of paper. You gotta think, don't cheat. Think of a sphere, or not a sphere, sorry, a cylinder. This is basically roughly a cylinder. Draw a cylinder only using 2 dimensions. So that means you got only a few options, right? The shapes that you can choose from are like squares, circles, rectangles, triangles. So draw a cylinder in 2 dimensions. You basically, unless you're cheating, you have 2 options. A cylinder is either a rectangle, right? Because you're looking at it from this direction, right? Or it's a circle as you're looking at it like this, right? Wouldn't you agree that the only way to draw a cylinder in 2 dimensions is either a rectangle or a circle, right? So the question is, which is it? Yes, all of the above, right? And can you imagine a world in where people fought and said, God is like this, and they said, no, God is like this, and they argued over something that we can't even wrap our minds around. And we get in these fights, and we have these theological wars, and we draw boundaries, and we say, you're in, you're out, and we're saying, we clearly understand God. And God, standing beyond all these dimensions, is going, you dummies. It doesn't even work like that. And I think so many times our theology actually keeps us enclosed in a box, and we argue and fight over, oh, I understand God perfectly. The Bible says that we all see through a glass dimly. We're trying to use words and metaphor and trying to explain things that we can't even wrap our heads around. We're like those people in Flatland, trying to argue our point of view, and God stands beyond all of it. Now, does that mean that it's worthless to try to understand God? No. Like we talked about earlier, it's very important that we understand our theology and we can explain it well and we can wrap our heads around it. Because if we don't, we'll argue and fight over things without understanding that maybe we're both wrong. Maybe we're all seeing through a glass dimly. See, imagine a God that stands beyond time, like outside of time. God created it. He stands outside of it. And we're trying to understand that God. And you might say, well, Dan, that kind of melts my mind. That kind of twists things around. I don't really understand it. And I would say, yes, exactly. In fact, one of the wisest, one of the most popular modern theologians in the past 100 years, he wrote, and I try to read his stuff and I'm like, my brain doesn't work, right? He said this, and this is gonna kind of mess with you, so just follow me. As we understand existence, if I were to ask you, does Abraham Lincoln exist? How would you answer? I mean, he existed. Like, what do you mean? In what time, right? We'd need some qualifying statements, right? Like, yes, I believe Abraham existed, but I mean, he doesn't exist like he's dead, you know? So we need some qualifiers. As we understand existence, how would we explain something that exists? It can be tactile, it can be felt, it can be something that operates in time, it can be a relationship. Those things exist, right? Wouldn't we believe that God is beyond all existence? So anytime we start describing something that exists, we would fall short of describing what God is like, right? Okay, so with that in mind, this theologian says this: God does not exist. He is being itself, beyond essence and existence. Therefore, to argue that God exists is to deny him. And we go, what? Well, slow down, right? And here's what he's saying. He says, as we understand existence, God can't exist in those terms. Now, we believe that yes, God exists. That's a theological claim. But as we understand it, he's beyond all of that. So you might be sitting here and you might be thinking, Dan, like, what does this have to do with me today? Right? Like this just seems so complicated. This just seems like so much. Where does this land for me today? Help me understand how this works at home tonight with my family. Help me understand how this is gonna work when I'm at work tomorrow. See, the key is to understand that our theology is shaping us, whether we realize it or not. It is impacting our prayers. It's impacting our worship. It's impacting our lives. So you might be thinking, why do I care? You know, it reminds me of a story that Dino, where's Dino at? Dino, right there. Reminds me of a story that Dino tells. And I'm not gonna do it justice. You gotta hear Dino stories from Dino. But he has this one story of one of his sons, Jonathan, and I'll leave him out, but won't use his name. So when Jonathan was in high school, Dino wanted to have this father-son heart-to-heart. And they wanted, he wanted to, invest into his son, really see where his son was at. And he took him out and his deep conversation, he poured out his heart and what he was going through and what he was thinking and what he was feeling. And Jonathan kind of sat there, glassy-eyed, listless, like he normally does. Jonathan just kind of sit there, I'm just kidding. And he just was kind of taking it in. And Dino's like, if you know Dino, he can just share, and he's sharing his heart and share. And he asked him, he goes, Jonathan, what do you think, man? Jonathan sits there for a moment and says, Dad, I guess my life's just not that complicated. right? Like, it's just like, my life's just not like there. And Dino just deflated in the moment. It was like, oh man, like so much, okay, let's get ice cream. You know, whatever it is, like, right? And you might be thinking, you're like, my life, Dan, my life's just not that complicated. God doesn't exist. God does exist. Shut up. God just exists, right? Like, you stop with your nonsense and theological. He just exists, right? And I understand that because we have to land somewhere. We have to have some sort of framework for understanding God, for wrapping our heads around there. I want you to write something down. Our actions are informed in every way by our beliefs. Our actions are informed in every way by our beliefs. And most importantly for you as Christians, your actions are formed by your theology, which is only understood as we understand reality, existence, talking about God. And we can't get to that without understanding these things. See, I love, there was these early theologians before even 200, Ignatius, one of the first theologians, even before he started writing, before we had really writings of what the earliest church fathers started writing as they understood God and did their best to explain these and give us theological terms. Before that, there was this group of Christian hermits, monks, nomads, nuns that lived in the deserts of Egypt only a couple hundred years prior to the first theologians writing. These were the first people living in the first century and second century after the death of Christ. Before we had any real theological writings, we had the Gospels, we had letters to the church, but really anyone expounding on these things, we have these theologians, and really it traveled with oral tradition. They would say these things, and finally it was kind of captured. It's called the Collections of the Desert Fathers. And I love what one of these desert fathers said, because I think this really helps us land the plane here and see where we're going to be going today. They said this. You should write this down. One cannot know God, for to know God is idolatry. So what that means is when you claim you've got God figured out, that's idolatry, because God is beyond any way that you can explain God. So to lift up your ideal and say, this is it, that's idolatry. So you cannot know God, for to know God is idolatry. You can only love God. And to love God is to know God. I love that. One cannot know God, for to know God is idolatry. You can only love God, and to love God is to know God. It's saying, in a sense, how we get to know God, how we experience God is by loving him. And as we love God, we understand him more and more. As we worship him, as we serve him, as we do these things, that is how we understand God. Not so that we can write down something and explain and win an argument of free will versus predestination. No. That's not knowing God. To know God is just to love God. That's how we experience this. See, I'm saying that our pursuit of our earthly understanding of God should be for a purpose and should help us better love God. So all of this talk, all of this understanding, these conversations about theology and all of these things, it's to say that our theology shapes our lives. And these beliefs are important for us to understand these because they're affecting how we live our lives. And if we want to understand God better, you don't need to go to some class. Those things can help give us some tools. But what you need to do is you need to love God. You need to follow him. And what does it look like to love God? What does it look like? What tools do we have? What direction arrows do we have? How do you love an intangible God that's beyond everything that we can claim that is existence? How do you love a God like that? We've got a great answer. And Jesus gave it to us. And all the commands of the Hebrew scriptures, and all of their understanding of who God was, and all their declarations of this is what God is like, of all their metaphors, of all these things, they had 613 commands. And then they had the Hebrew oral tradition where they would, go on and say, this is what this means. And by saying you can't work on the Sabbath, here's what we mean by work. And there's all of these rules. And Jesus said, of those, these are the most important. But then he dies, he resurrects, he's with his disciples, and he says, I've got a new one. I've got a new command you've never heard before in all of Israel. And it goes like this. John 13:34. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. you also are to love one another. So he says, you see how I lived my life? Love each other like that. You see how I served one another, how I served you? Serve people like that. So my question for you is, does your theology lead you to loving like Jesus? Does your theology lead you to loving like Jesus loved? Let me rephrase this a little bit different, because we understand that our theology, that's the best we have to understand God. Does your God lead you to loving like Jesus? Because if he doesn't, I would argue you're not following the God of Jesus. So why is our theology important? Because Jesus said it's of utmost importance. It is how we know God. It's through loving like Jesus loved. If the band will go ahead and come up, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here in just a moment. See, all of this brings us back to the drawings from the beginning. I want you to go back to the beginning where you drew your pictures of God. I'm curious what you drew. I'm curious when I said, draw a picture of God, what your mind went to. When I asked you to describe what God is like, what did your mind go to? When you walk into church, what do you think about when you walk in? What do you feel? Remember, our theology can give us a visceral reaction. Maybe when you screwed up the night before or the week before, you made some really boneheaded decisions, and you walk into a room like this, and the band is playing worship songs, and we're talking about God. What do you think about then? What kind of picture of God would you draw at that moment? Basically, what I'm getting at is, as you understand God, who is God? See, and the answer to that question will shape everything. It will shape our actions, our responses. It will shape how we treat one another. And it even changes our brain. There's this book that is pretty mind-blowing, a book called How God Changes Your Brain. It's written by a neuroscientist. It's written by two different guys, and I want to be honest, this is not a Christian theological book, whatever a Christian book is, right? Like it's one guy who's a Christian and one guy who's agnostic. And what they did is they did brain scans of people who believed in God. They did these active brain scans on them and asked them questions about God and watched what happens in their brain. And this book talks about how people's brains are actually shaped by belief in God. And it's crazy because one guy is a Christian. He's talking about the theological implications of this. And the other guy, he's just a neuroscientist. He's like, here are the facts. Just here's the data. I don't care about anything else. Here's the data. And here's what they found. I thought this was interesting. I just want to read this for you. Andrew Newberg is one of the authors. He's the Christian. Newberg revealed that there are two major neurological models of God in our world today. See, because they're primarily looking at Christians, but they looked at people from all different religious backgrounds because they wanted to see what difference it made. This is just purely brain science. I'm not making any implications beyond this. I'm just wanting to show us how our thoughts about God even change our brains. The first exists in people who view God as primarily angry or wrathful. And the second in people who view God primarily as loving. Both of these God models affect the way that people view the world and interact with others. Newberg found that the angry God offered certainty and impulse control. He said there are some benefits in viewing God primarily as angry and wrathful, that it gave us a view of the world with certainty, and we all cling to certainty, and also gave us better impulse control, which makes sense, right? If you view God as primarily angry and he's going to zap you, you're better at impulse control, right? I'm going to choose not to do that. Then it says Newberg found that the angry God, but at the cost. So it wasn't just a free trade-off. At the cost of elevated stress, increased hostility towards outsiders. The loving God, on the other hand, produced benefits in health and cognition. Contemplating a loving God strengthens portions of your brain, particularly in the frontal lobes and the anterior cingulate, where empathy and reason reside. Contemplating a wrathful God empowers the limbic system, which is filled with aggression and fear. It is a sobering concept. The God we choose to love changes us into his image, whether he exists or not, is what these neuroscientists are saying. They're saying the people that these people believe in, the God that these people believe in, actually changes them into that very image. Contemplating a loving God rather than a punitive God reduces anxiety, depression, and stress, and increases feelings of security, compassion, and love. So in these drawings, in your explanation of God, I'm not saying that God isn't a judge, that God isn't wrathful. I'm not making any claims about that. All I'm saying is who God primarily is, because every single one of these are a legitimate metaphor for God, right? But the God we worship, the God we primarily think of, the one that we fixate on, the one that we contemplate, that is shaping our brains. See, your theology matters. Do you view God as primarily vengeful and wrathful? The way you live your life, the way you make your daily choices. Do you do things because you serve a loving God that's outlined the best way for you to live and want you to commune with him in harmony? Or do you make choices? Do you avoid certain things because there's an angry, vengeful God just waiting to get you? Your theology is shaping your brain, whether you realize it or not. I want you to think about this, seriously. In fact, do this, close your eyes. Everybody close your eyes. Who is Jesus to you? We're talking about your theology here. We're not making God up into something. Don't make any arguments, oh, you're trying to change God. No, I'm just asking you what your theology is. So who is Jesus? Is Jesus the guy protecting you from the angry Heavenly Father? Is Jesus primarily the perfect one that dove in front of that cosmic bullet of God's, of his wrath, saving you just in the nick of time? When you fall short in sin, how do you approach God? What's your response? Do you feel shame? Do you find yourself slinking into God's presence like an abused animal? Do you find yourself throwing yourself down at the mercy of an angry judge, just praying to Jesus that he hasn't gotten fed up with this routine yet? Or is Jesus the perfect embodiment of who God is? Jesus, the incarnation. When you think of God, when you picture God, do you see Jesus smiling with his disciples? Do you see God shooing away the religious Pharisees and bending low to the adulterous woman, saying, I don't condemn you? Do you see God saying to you, love this world as I have? Because God wanted to reveal himself to humanity. First, he chose a nation and they fell short. Then he chose to show up on the scene in flesh and blood. And God got a face in Jesus. His actions were revealed for the world to see. His mission revealed as he recycled the sin of the world into forgiveness, love, and compassion. And then he gave us a mission. Then he gave you a job. It's our job, the church, to show the world what God is like. And for us to show the world what God is like, we've got to get our theology right, our understanding of who God is. See, it was the psalmist that nailed it when they said, writing about the gods that people create for themselves, as they said, those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. Say that's true for us today. The neuroscientists found our theology is going to shape us into a certain kind of person. And it's not that any of these analogies are wrong, but it's how we approach God. It's our theology of who God is. It's our understanding of how we interact with our Heavenly Father. For some of you, That name evokes love, compassion, and gentleness. And for some of you, that analogy pushes you away from that God. See, your theology, it matters. See, what we want to do is we want to become more like Jesus. Our theology must be informed by Jesus. Allow me to end with Paul's words to the church in Rome. See, these Christians should know the kind of sacrifice that God desires. So as the prophets these Romans would know of that spoke, that God desires mercy and a contrite heart, an acknowledgement of what God is like. That is the sacrifice he's looking for. And with that in mind, me read for you the words of Paul. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in full view of God's mercy, to offer yourselves, your bodies, as living sacrifice. That contrite heart, that mercy, that acknowledgement of what God is like, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. God, I thank you so much.